My name's Mike Barrett. I'm the Executive Director of Conservation and Science at WWF-UK. The Living Planet report is a report, a biennial report that we've been producing since 1998. It's designed to be the most comprehensive assessment of the state of nature and the environment on the planet. And I've been involved in its production since 2014. I've written various sections for it. I'm on the editorial board, and I've produced some of the research for it.
Can you explain what the overriding message of the report has been in recent years?
When the Living Planet report started, it was really sort of set up to document the state of the environment on the planet and trends in environmental conditions over time. And it's focused throughout its existence on something called the Living Planet Index, which is a measure of the abundance of vertebrate populations across the planet. But actually, over time, we've also set that in the context of a broader set of measures of environmental health, as well as simply documenting trends over time, which sadly have demonstrated a decline in the environmental condition of the planet. We've also increasingly produced information around what is driving change, what's behind the changes that we are seeing. Also, in more recent years, we've set this in a broader sort of global context to explain why it matters, how what we are monitoring, what we're seeing right now is part of a change in geological epoch. So we're moving into this new epoch called the Anthropocene, which is just a measure of the degree to which humanity has impacted the state of the planet. We've set it in the context of the risk that we're moving into a sixth global mass extinction phase. And we've also linked these various different metrics, these measures of condition on the planet, to the idea of tipping points, and the fact that we can, if we push certain environmental systems on the planet too far, then you go into a danger zone and potentially a tipping point beyond which you can't go back to where you came from. But I think crucially also what we have done in the latest edition that came out in September last year was to demonstrate the potential solutions and the fact that actually all isn't lost, and that we can actually reverse the losses of nature on the planet that we have seen if we act now. And we know what the causes are, and so we do actually know what the levers are that we have to pull. So I think that's a really exciting part of the reports now, is setting out the blueprint for what has to change to put the world on the right track.
Okay, well, I'll pick up some of those themes in a minute, but can I just ask a question? Because you mentioned sort of early on in that answer, you know, and I remember that the headline statistic that I read back in 2018 that kind of led to me beginning this project was all about vertebrates. Why did you choose to focus on vertebrates? Because I mean, you know, there's a lot of concern about insect depletion.
Yeah, so the index that we work with, it's actually jointly owned between ourselves and WWF and the Zoological Society of London. It focuses on vertebrates, because vertebrates actually is a huge sort of category of species on the planet, because it includes you know, birds, mammals, reptiles, fish. It's amphibians. So it's an awful lot of the world around us. But you're right, it's not everything. It's not vegetation. It's not insects. It's not invertebrates. But there are other indices that other organizations own and produce that cover those too. And there's some fascinating work that has come out of Germany in recent years, monitoring declines of insect populations even within protected areas, which is actually deeply troubling, the degree of declines that they've seen. So so what we have tried to do, rather than just replicating what others do, we have accumulated all these different indices in one place to show what the overall story is. The risk otherwise, you take one particular metric out of context and it can produce quite a narrow story. The real power, I think, of the Living Planet reports is that it actually demonstrates that you can take any given global metric of biodiversity and it adds up to tell the same story, and unfortunately a story of catastrophic decline of nature on the planet.
Well, It was perfect, actually, that you used the word biodiversity then, because I was just going to say, you know, in talking about these subjects, we kind of use the word the state of the environment, we use nature. There are various words that are kind of interchangeably used. But can you explain the term biodiversity for people a bit? Because that's the main term that we're using in this project, and I think it's quite a complex term.
Yes, it can be, although I think at its very simplest level, if we can just view it as being all life on the planet. And that, of course, includes us, it includes people. So we are part of biodiversity too. But that is everything from, you know, the microbes in the soil through to, you know, blue whales or the most majestic rainforest trees. This is all biodiversity. And right down to, you know, bacteria and viruses, coronavirus, it's part of biodiversity. So biodiversity is all encompassing. It is life on the planet. And actually, I suppose another way of viewing it is it is also our life support system on the planet. It's why we're here. We're here because of biodiversity.
Yeah, I heard it really nicely described by Partha Dasgupta, who wrote the report about the economics of biodiversity. And he just said, nature is our home. Biodiversity is all life on the planet. But how is biodiversity and the health of biodiversity kind of important to the sustenance of life on our planet? You know, it's not just a lot of species and having a great variety of species. Can you give us a sense of why it's important that we have that variety?
Yeah, so I mean, I described earlier biodiversity as being our life support system and all life on the planet. And as Dasgupta said, it is our home, but it's also us, it's us and our home. We've got to think about what biodiversity provides for us. And biodiversity, nature on the planet, that's what regulates for us the availability of the clean air that we breathe, the availability of the clean water that we drink. It's the health of the soils, you know, the nutrients, the pollinators that provide the food that we eat. The function that the Amazon rainforest plays, for example, it does a number of things at global and local or regional scale. So at a global scale, we know it's a key part of the jigsaw of regulating global climate. If, you know, without a functioning Amazon rainforest, which stores 73 billion tons of carbon, there is no realistic prospect of avoiding dangerous global climate change. So that's a global good, a global function that it plays for us. At a more regional level, essentially the rainforest functions by means of moisture coming off the Atlantic Ocean being absorbed by trees, taken down into the soils, rainfall and so on. The trees then absorb moisture from the soils, re-emit it into the air, and it moves on. It moves further west towards the Andes. And so you essentially have what are sometimes called flying rivers. It's sort of clouds of moisture that are being produced by the rainforest itself. That hits the Andes and then turns south. It provides rainfall further south in South America. And when you start to degrade the Amazon rainforest, as we are doing at the moment, then the risk is you start to switch that system off, and that sort of transport of moisture further south into the continent becomes far more unreliable. And we have seen some pretty catastrophic droughts in South America recently. It was only a few years since Sao Paulo ran out of water. You know, Sao Paulo is a megacity and ran out of water. It's just extraordinary. And we can actually measure now, and we are measuring now, a decrease in the moisture above the Amazon rainforest where it's being degraded due to human activity. So we're changing the local climate. That then also has a further local impact, which is that as you dry the atmosphere becomes more suitable to a savanna rather than a rainforest. And once you hit a tipping point, you will move to a situation where the rainforest will degrade, it will convert to savanna, and then you have no rainforest. And I've talked about the role that you know, the Amazon plays in regulating global climate. Well, if we hit that tipping point, we switch off this sort of moisture recycling, we degrade the forest, that's of catastrophic impact, you know, globally from a climatic perspective. So that, I mean, that's just one example of the role that nature provides for us that we often take for granted. It regulates air quality, availability of moisture, climate, availability of food, and so on.
You referred to the chopping down of the rainforest there. What are the major threats to biodiversity that have been identified in the report? Why is biodiversity or nature in so much trouble?
In compiling our Living Planet Index, we do analyze what the threats associated with any particular data set for any particular species population is. And so we've got planet-wide. And the key threat, the majority of the threats to nature on this planet is actually the way that we produce and consume food. What we're seeing is a conversion of habitat, a loss and fragmentation of natural habitat on the planet, and that's driven by the way that we produce and consume food. That's the primary threat at the moment. Then coming down the tracks, we've also got the sort of the exacerbating effect of climate change and what that will mean for nature. And of course, we understand the feedback loop that there is between the loss of nature and the acceleration of climate change, and then what climate change means for the further accelerating loss of nature. So you end up with this sort of spiral. But primarily, the immediate threat, the biggest immediate threat, is the way that we produce and consume food.
This is absolutely coming across in every interview we've done and every film we've got. It's quite astonishing. I mean, we have to start eating more plant-based food, and we have to start farming more sustainably. I mean, I think, would you agree with those two?
I mean, in terms of the dietary aspect, it depends on where you are on the planet. I mean, there are many of us, including where I live in the UK, who we consume more protein than we need, and we consume more animal-based protein than we should, than is good for the planet. That doesn't mean the entire world has to become vegetarian. It doesn't. There are plenty of parts of the world where people are not getting sufficient nutrition, they're not getting enough protein, and they are understandably in some parts of the world still reliant upon meat protein. And actually, it's possible to produce meat sustainably as well, just not at the scale for 7.5 billion people that we're trying to consume it in the north and the west of the planet. So there does have to be some degree of diet shift, but you're also right that the key thing is the way that we produce food. And we have essentially a model at the moment which is based upon the idea that there is an infinite supply of land, and that we can move on to a new area of land, cut down the forest or the grass and whatever may be there, graze our cattle, grow our crops, degrade the soil over a period of time, and then just move on to the next piece of land. And so we have this sort of constantly moving footprint, which then leaves degraded land behind us. And the reality, of course, is that we don't have an infinite amount of land. We've got a finite amount, and we can't keep on doing that. So the trick is to work out how we actually use land sustainably. So for example, if I take the Brazilian context, we know that cattle grazing and soy production is a major driver of the conversion of habitat and the loss of forests. But Brazil could actually triple its soy production without cutting down another tree. And they could do that by restoring the degraded agricultural lands that do exist. I mean, in the Sahara alone, 40 million hectares of available degraded land. It has been used for agriculture, and then when the soil has become depleted, they move on to a new area and leave the degraded land behind. So, and at the moment, there is absolutely no incentive to invest in restoring those degraded lands, because it's far cheaper to move on to a new area of land and deforest it. You can acquire the land legally or otherwise, deforest it at very little price. Whoever has deforested the land can sell it on a significant profit to an agricultural producer, who then knows that there is a global market for their produce. In a world where it is possible to sell the produce from deforested land, because there are no laws keeping it out of supply chains, and in a world where there is no financial incentive or economic provision to pay for the cost of restoring degraded lands, of course we're trapped in this cycle. The trick is to make sure that we put in place the right measures to take deforesting or habitat converting produce out of our supply chains. Simply make it illegal to trade in this. I mean, it's outrageous that it is legal to trade in produce from deforested land. Make that illegal, take it out of supply chains, and provide the credit, the finance that farmers need to shift back onto and restore the degraded land that is available and can indeed be restored. It's technically perfectly possible to do it. You can plant certain crops that will help regenerate carbon in the soils. And actually, this isn't unique to Latin America. I mean, I've visited farms on Salisbury Plain in the UK where you have farmers who are sowing certain crops in order to increase the carbon content of their soils because they know it will then produce more. So it's perfectly possible. There are natural ways you can help regenerate soils, and including grazing the right animals as well, who will help them tread seeds into the soil and help regenerate. It's perfectly possible to farm in a regenerative way.
Right. And does this relate then to, because WWF and a number of other conservation organisations signed this joint statement on a post-2020 framework for biodiversity? Can you just give me a little context for why that framework, or why that statement was signed now? And are some of the things that you're calling for related to what you're talking about, removing economic incentives for, or removing the possibility, in fact, for just moving on in the kind of...
Certainly. So I think there are two important aspects to this statement, to what we're calling for by way of a new deal for nature, new deal for people and nature. First of all, we have to shift the entire level of ambition. If you look at previous global agreements on nature or biodiversity, the language always tends to be framed in terms of slowing rates of loss. Even when it comes to deforestation, you have countries and companies who have signed up to the idea that we will, at some point in the future, we will slow the rate of loss of forest. Now, in a world where we have already lost too much nature, the idea that you can lose more but just slow the rate of loss is actually clearly ludicrous. So we have to change the entire discourse to one of an acceptance that actually what is needed is to halt loss and to restore. We need more nature on the planet and not less. So this is this concept that we've been talking about around bending the curve of biodiversity loss. We have to halt this decline. We've got to actually halt decline and then move into a world where we are restoring nature on the planet. We need more nature, not less. So that has to be the overall objective, and a sort of a nature positive world. But in order to do that, we also have to shift the underlying models. So again, historic agreements around the conservation of biodiversity seem that they are based on a very simple premise that somehow if you pay enough money and ask people to protect land, that will be sufficient. And to be blunt, this is primarily quite a sort of a neo-colonial idea that we in the wealthier northern parts of the world who have already trashed our biodiversity, we will now pay people in other parts of the world to keep their biodiversity in place. What that completely fails to do is to introduce any kind of obligation to actually change the way that we behave, to change the way we produce and consume, and particularly again in the food and agriculture sector. It allows countries like the UK, for example, to continue to offshore its biodiversity loss. And that's what we do at the moment. We've trashed our own biodiversity. Now we're trashing other people's. I mean, the UK uses an area 5 times the size of Greater London in Brazil alone to produce what we import. Until we can actually include in these agreements the idea that countries who are importing this loss of biodiversity take responsibility for their footprint and commit to reduce their footprint on other parts of the world. So it's not just about the biodiversity within our borders, it's biodiversity globally. Until we can actually shift the system so that people take responsibility for footprint through international trade and the way that we produce and consume, we will not be able to bend that curve of biodiversity loss. But the science is really clear, and this is what the last Living Planet report showed. It is possible to do that. If you do make these systemic changes, then despite the fact that we have decimated nature on this planet, it's still not too late. We can still bend this curve of biodiversity loss. By the end of this decade, we could be in a nature positive world where we're putting more back into the planet than we're taking out, but only through that systemic change. And that's what's got to be committed to in the international agreements this year.